Death at Tsavo by Henry Risham Lanier. Of all the yarns with which African hunters thrilled stay-at-homes, there is surely none more memorable than the story of the man-eaters of Tsavo. In the spring of 1898, an English engineer officer, Lieutenant Colonel J. H. Patterson, arrived at the railhead of the Uganda Railway, then 132 miles inland from Mombasa, the terminus on the east coast of Africa. The line had been finished to the Tsavo River, a swift stream flowing between tall trees amid an apparently endless and impenetrable jungle of stunted growth and rate-a-bit thorn bushes. Only an occasional heat-blistered ridge of red rock broke the monotony of this desolate Nyika, whose leafless dwarf trees and relentless scraggle seemed to hem in the narrow railway clearing threateningly. Colonel Patterson's task was to build a permanent bridge across the Tsavo and complete the road for 30 miles on each side of it. In a short time the Tsavo jungle resounded with the noise of drilling, blasting, and all the bustling activity of a construction camp. A few days after work started, there was a rumor that 2 lions had been seen prowling about, and presently it was reported to the engineer that a couple of coolies had been carried off at night from their tents by the beasts. The district officer was appealed to for aid, and came with as many askaris as he could spare. But as this dignitary walked in the dust from Tsavo Station to Colonel Patterson's camp, a lion actually sprang upon him, wounded him, and carried off his sergeant, who was holding a lamp behind him. The superintendent of police and other officials also arrived on the scene to take part in the campaign, and 2 sepoys were installed as bait in the lion trap. Our preparations were quite complete by nightfall, and we all took up our appointed positions. Nothing happened until about 9 o'clock, when to my great satisfaction the intense stillness was suddenly broken by the noise of the trap clattering down. At last, I thought, one at least of the brutes is done for, but the squeal was an ignominious one. The bait sepoys had a large lamp burning inside their part of the cage, and were each armed with a martini rifle, with plenty of ammunition. They had also been given strict orders to shoot at once if a lion should enter the trap. Instead of doing so, however, they were so terrified when he rushed in and began to lash himself madly against the bars of the cage, that they completely lost their heads, and were actually too unnerved to fire. Not for some minutes, not indeed till Mr. Farquhar, whose post was close by, shouted at them and cheered them on, did they at all recover themselves. Then when at last they began to fire, they fired with a vengeance, anywhere, anyhow. Whitehead and I were at right angles to the direction in which they should have shot, and yet their bullets came whizzing all around us. Altogether they fired over a score of shots, and in the end succeeded only in blowing away one of the bars of the door, thus allowing our prize to make good his escape. The coolies were more than ever convinced that the lions were really evil spirits, not to be slain by weapons of man. But, downcast as he was, Patterson decided to add one more to his long series of night watches. He had a stage of 4 poles built, about 10 feet from the remains of a donkey the lion had killed. Seated on a plank, lashed to this precarious structure, he awaited the coming of his wily enemies. Darkness fell almost immediately, and everything became extraordinarily still. The silence of an African jungle on a dark night needs to be experienced to be realized. It is most impressive, especially when one is absolutely alone and isolated from one's fellow creatures as I was then. the solitude and stillness, and from a condition of strained expectancy, I gradually fell into a dreamy mood which harmonized well with my surroundings. Suddenly I was startled out of my reverie by the snapping of a twig, and straining my ears for a further sound, I fancied I could hear the rustling of a large body forcing its way through the bush. The man-eater, I thought to myself. Surely tonight my luck will change, and I shall beg one of the brutes. Profound silence again succeeded. I sat on my eyrie like a statue, every nerve tense with excitement. Very soon, however, all doubt as to the presence of the lion was dispelled. A deep, long-drawn sigh, sure sign of hunger, came up from the bushes, and the rustling commenced again as he cautiously advanced. In a moment or two a sudden stop, followed by an angry growl, told me that my presence had been noticed, and I began to fear that disappointment awaited me once more. But no, matters quickly took an unexpected turn. The hunter became the hunted, and instead of either making off or coming for the bait prepared for him, the lion began stealthily to stalk me. For about 2 hours he horrified me by slowly creeping round and round my crazy structure, gradually edging his way nearer and nearer. Every moment I expected him to rush it, and the staging had not been constructed with an eye to such a possibility. If one of the rather flimsy poles should break, or if the lion could spring the 12 feet which separated me from the ground, the thought was scarcely a pleasant one. I began to feel distinctly creepy, and heartily repented my folly in having placed myself in such a dangerous position. I kept perfectly still, however, hardly daring even to blink my eyes, but the long, continued strain was telling on my nerves, and my feelings may be better imagined than described, when about midnight, suddenly, something came, flop, and struck me on the back of the head. For a moment I was so terrified that I nearly fell off the plank, as I thought that the lion had sprung on me from behind. Regaining my senses in a second or two, I realized that I had been hit by nothing more formidable than an owl, which had doubtless mistaken me for the branch of a tree. Not a very alarming thing to happen in ordinary circumstances, I admit, but coming at the time it did, it almost paralyzed me. The involuntary start I could not help giving was immediately answered by a sinister growl from below. After this I again kept as still as I could, though absolutely trembling with excitement, and in a short while I heard the lion begin to creep stealthily toward me. I could barely make out his form as he crouched among the whitish undergrowth, but I saw enough for my purpose, and before he could come any nearer, I took careful aim and pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot was at once followed by a most terrific roar, and then I could hear him leaping about in all directions. I was no longer able to see him, however, as his first bound had taken him into the thick bush, but to make assurance doubly sure, I kept blazing away in the direction in which I heard him plunging about. At length came a series of mighty groans, gradually subsiding into deep sighs, and finally ceasing altogether, and I felt convinced that one of the devils who had so long harried us would trouble us no more. As soon as I ceased firing, a tumult of inquiring voices was borne across the dark jungle from the men in camp, about a quarter of a mile away. I shouted back that I was safe and sound, and that one of the lions was dead, whereupon such a mighty cheer went up from all the camps as must have astonished the denizens of the jungle for miles around. Shortly I saw scores of lights twinkling through the bushes. Every man in camp turned out, and with tom-toms beating and horns blowing, came running to the scene. They surrounded my eyrie, and to my amazement, prostrated themselves on the ground before me, saluting me with cries of "Mabarak! Mabarak!" which I believe means Blessed One, or Saviour. All the same, I refused to allow any search to be made that night for the body of the lion, in case his companion might be close by. Besides, it was possible that he might be still alive, and capable of making a last spring. Accordingly, we all returned in triumph to the camp, where great rejoicings were kept up for the remainder of the night, the Swahili and other African natives celebrating the occasion by an especially wild and savage dance. In the morning, Colonel Patterson discovered that at last his luck had turned. There lay, crouched as if alive, a huge lion which measured 9 feet 8 inches in length, stood 3 feet 9 inches high, and required 8 men to drag him back to camp. A few days later, he had the satisfaction of looking on the dead body of the second man-eater, with 6 bullet holes in it. The same workmen who had shortly before plotted to murder him because of his strictness sent him a beautiful silver bowl as a token of their gratitude.